Chapter 5 looks at what we call price ceilings and price floors. This is really an extension of the material that we looked at in the last chapter. So here's one way to think about it. In the last chapter, we talked about the market adjustment process and how markets tend to go back towards market clearing, towards equilibrium. And we started by sort of saying, well, what happens if the price of a good is above that equilibrium price or the price of a good is below that equilibrium price? And we walked our way through the market adjustment process to show how it will get back toward equilibrium. But notice something interesting there, right? That price was free to move. It just was sort of stuck temporarily away from the equilibrium, the market clearing price. But here's an interesting question. What if the price is not free to move? That is, what if the price is set by law at above or below the market clearing price? What happens if the price can't adjust in the face of that competitive pressure from buyers and sellers that we talked about in the last chapter? That's a really interesting set of questions that we're going to talk about, and we can think about these examples of government set prices. We've got a few the obvious ones we can talk about. The two biggies we usually talk about are rent control, which sets a price below market clearing, and minimum wage laws, which set a price above market clearing, above equilibrium. There's some other examples we'll talk about too, but those are the biggies that we tend to think about. So with that in mind, let's take a look and think about how this works. So first, we're going to start by talking about the idea of a price ceiling. Okay. Now, what's tricky about price ceilings is we hear the word ceiling and we think high. Okay. But when we talk about price ceilings in economics, we're talking about prices that have been set by law below the market clearing level, or at least be more specific, the maximum price set by law. Normally, it's below market clearing, right? So, and we'll talk to them about that and about the effects. But it's tricky because you think ceiling and you think above. But the whole point is it's a ceiling and it's below market clearing. That means, imagine a ceiling, you're trying to go up above it. You can't. It's a ceiling. You want to get to market clearing, but you can't because that price is stuck by law below. So price ceilings normally are, again, maximum price prescribed by law, but to have effects, they have to be below market clearing, right? If we put a price ceiling on, a maximum price on, and it was above market clearing, it wouldn't have any effect because nobody wants to, the price isn't going to go that high anyway. Price is going to stop at market clearing. And this is a really important point to keep in mind, right? If the government tries to set a maximum price, say, like a rent control price, above the market clearing rent, it's not going to have any effect. It doesn't matter. People are going to ignore it because they don't want rents to be that high anyway. So do keep that in mind as we go along. So what's the result of an effective price ceiling, where we keep the price by law below market clearing? The most important one, there's 5, and the most important one is we get the shortages that we talked about previously, right? We're going to have quantity demanded greater than quantity supplied at that artificially low price. People are going to want more of the good than suppliers are willing to supply. We're going to get shortages. But unlike last chapter, there's no mechanism here, or we've cut off the mechanism by which that price can adjust. The law doesn't allow price to adjust. What's now important to recognize is that, remember all that competition among buyers, right, to resolve the shortage by bidding the price up. They can't do that now. It's illegal. So what's going to happen instead? We know competition isn't going to go away. We know people are going to somehow want to figure out how to deal with that shortage in one way or another. So there's several other things that can happen. One of the things that can happen when you have a price ceiling is a reduction in product quality. Okay, so if you can't charge, you're a seller, right, and you can't charge the full price you'd want to be able to charge to cover the cost of the good that you produced, one way that you can make yourself profitable, because you can't change the price you're selling at, you can reduce your costs. And one way to reduce your costs is to reduce product quality. There's a great example in the textbook that I'd never heard of before from the 1970s, where George Meany, who was president of the AFL-CIO, was complaining about his favorite deli where he would go to get matzo ball soup. And he noticed one day that the number of matzo balls in the matzo ball soup had dropped, I think, from 4 to 3. And he was complaining, right, to the management. And the answer was, this was during price controls in the 1970s. They could not charge a price at which 4 matzo balls in the matzo ball soup was profitable, so they began to cut back on the number of matzo balls. We see this in other ways too. As I mentioned, one of the most common price controls, price ceilings is rent control, where we put a maximum price on rent. And what we know is in neighborhoods where that maximum price on rent is there, we see the quality of apartments begin to deteriorate. People simply can't, the owners can't charge a price that covers them for all the maintenance costs and so on. And so we begin to see apartments begin to fall in quality. And we see this in other ways too. For watering down alcohol when price controls are on alcohol, all kinds of examples like this. Another thing we see are wasteful lines and search costs. In the 1970s, and I'm old enough to remember this, when there were price controls on gasoline, on oil, prices were kept low, we had shortages. People would drive around, right, trying to find gas stations where the lines weren't very long, right? So two things were happening, right? People were lining up for gas, and secondly, people were driving around spending gasoline, right, trying to find places that either had shorter lines or even had gas at all as places began to run out of gas. We see this, by the way, and I'm going to come back to this at the end of this lecture. We see this today often after a natural disaster like a hurricane, when local authorities put maximum price laws in place or anti-price gouging laws in place and try to keep prices artificially low for things like gasoline or water or ice. We see exactly this happen. We see shortages. We see people lining up. We see people engage in all kinds of search costs. Right, the fact that people can't sell the good at a price that covers their costs means we get all of these problems. In addition to all that, we get losses of gains from trade. Right, we see fewer trades take place because we have the shortage and suppliers are only willing to supply a certain amount. You can take a look at what a price ceiling looks like on a supply and demand graph, and you can see, right, where that shortage is, and you can see the way in which that the quantity that will get traded is to the left of the market clearing equilibrium price and quantity. As we were discussing last chapter, what does that mean? One of the things that means is that we see exchanges that could have taken place that would be profitable not take place at all. So whenever the quantity of goods and services actually exchanges to the left of market clearing, we have that problem. And finally, just a general overall misallocation of resources. There's no assurance in a shortage economy with price ceilings like this that the people who are getting the good are putting it to the highest valued uses. Again, think about our water example. Suppose during a hurricane we put a price control. We don't allow people to raise the price for selling water, for selling ice. The people who get it just happen to be the ones who end up at the front of the line or can afford to pay someone to wait in line for them. This is all misallocation of resources, of course, too. But they get the good at the low price controlled price. There's no reason why they won't use it on relatively frivolous things. You might well bathe your dog with water that cheap. You might well use the ice to keep your beer cold, when in fact there's someone else out there who would like the ice to keep their insulin refrigerated, right? Or something like that. So one of the problems with price ceilings, with those price controls, is that at the artificially low price, we have no way to signal to people that this good is extremely valuable at the moment, or more valuable than the actual price is, that will encourage them to use the good more wisely. And this is, again, especially the case during natural disasters. So all kinds of misallocations of resources are part of this process as well. So those are some of the things that happen as a result of price ceilings. If you take a look through the chapter, there's some additional discussion of rent controls and how this works with rent controls. I commend that to your attention. I'm not going to walk through it here, but it's certainly worth your time. So what about price floors, right? Price floor is a minimum price allowed by law. And again, same sort of thing now, mirror image. It can be deceptive because we think of a floor as being at the bottom, and so it's tempting to think that a price floor is something below market clearing. But to be effective, right, a minimum price allowed by law, right, has to be above market clearing in order to matter, right? If you set it below market clearing, nobody wants to go that low. They want to go to the equilibrium, to the market clearing price. But if you set it above equilibrium, right, then you cut off that adjustment process and you prevent it from going toward equilibrium. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, one of the great examples of a price floor, of course, is minimum wage law. And so people might say, well, we think the market clearing wage is too low, whatever that means. But another example we have of this is agricultural subsidies, where oftentimes there's price floors for particular agricultural goods, where we say the price is too low to make it profitable for farmers or ranchers or whatever. So we're going to set the price higher than that, minimum price higher than that, and try to force people to sort of pay a higher wage, right? You can think about the debate that's going on over $15 an hour minimum wage, or we're going to force them to pay more for the agricultural products. Okay, the whole point is you don't want it to go to the governments, people setting the prices don't want them to go to the market clearing price. That's the whole point, all right? That's why you set the minimum price above the market clearing price. So what are the consequences of price floors? Well, surpluses. Exactly as in the last chapter, if the price is above market clearing, you get a surplus. But unlike last chapter, where there was no barrier to that price adjusting downward toward market clearing, this time it's illegal. Right? It's illegal for people to sell at a lower price. Okay, so what we end up getting are surpluses. We get more quantity supplied greater than quantity demanded, and we get stuck there. So again, think about a minimum wage law, right? If you increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour, there's a lot of people who are willing to go out and get a job, want to get a job at $15 an hour. The supply, that's the supply of labor, right, will increase. The quantity supplied of labor will increase as you bump up towards $15 an hour. But think about from the demand side, right? What are firms thinking? What are employers thinking? At $15 an hour, I can't afford to hire all the people that I might be hiring right now at $8 or $10 an hour. So I'm not going to offer as many jobs. In fact, I'm going to look for substitutes. So one of the things, it's not the only reason, but one of the reasons we see the ordering kiosks at places like McDonald's is that as minimum wage laws have taken, as minimum wage has gone up, places like McDonald's are trying to find a way to get their product sold without as much labor if they can. And so we see the self-ordering kiosks and other kinds of things happening in those places. It's not the only reason. There's other things happening, right? But it is certainly a factor in those. So we get surpluses. And what are some of the other related consequences here? Again, same as with the price ceilings, with price floors, we get lost gains from trade. There are, again, think about minimum wage. There are workers who would be willing to work for $12 an hour, $11, $10, $9 an hour. There are employers who would be willing to pay them that much, but they can't. It's against the law for them to do that. And notice, right, this is not just it's not just against the law for the employer to pay them that much. It's against the law for the employee to accept that much, right? You can't just regulate one side of that market. Both parties are being regulated here, and you're telling people on one side of the market, you're telling workers whose labor is not quite $15 an hour, but less than that, you're saying to them, sorry, you can't have a job because we have to pay you at least 15. Firms would gladly pay them 9, 10, 11, 12 if they could, but if the minimum wage is 15, that they can't. The surplus that's created, of course, when we talk about minimum wage laws, we have a name for that, right? When we have a name for people who are looking for jobs and can't find them, unemployed. And we're going to talk a lot more in the chapter on unemployment about this, but the thing you need to see now is that the surplus created by minimum wage laws as price floors is unemployment, manifests itself as unemployment. So we see that, we see the lost gains from trade, from people not being able to execute trades that they otherwise would. We see wasteful increases in quality. Now this is the opposite of what we were talking about with price ceilings. The best example of this goes back again to the 70s and 80s, at a time when the airlines were heavily regulated and often would set their prices, were legally, so by law, the Civil Aeronautics Board enabled them to charge a price above market clearing. And at that super high price, two things were happening, right? They were earning enough revenues to do this, but they were also finding they couldn't compete on price, right? They couldn't compete by saying we're cheaper. You think about airlines today, how they, at least in theory, try to track you in with bargains and sales and so on. They couldn't do that, right? Because the price was set by law back in the 70s. So how would they compete? By saying, oh, well, our airline offers better meals, we have bigger seats, right? In the 70s, it was also, we have better looking stewardesses than the other folks, right? So all the ways that firms, that airlines would advertise were about the quality of their product. And the interesting question is this wasteful, right? Would people rather have cheaper fares and not have, fancy gourmet meals and coach and put up with smaller seats, and they don't really care what the flight attendants look like? And it turns out that's true, right? We know now, because we have that competition, we don't have those price controls anymore, that people in fact would rather pay the low price and not get the other increases in quality. So from what we know now and what we suspected back then, those were wasteful increases in quality. And again, we get the same sort of misallocation of resources that we were talking about earlier, right? We get people getting access to when we have a surplus. People, who gets the jobs is a good, interesting question, right? Or is it really the people who for whom this is the most valuable? So very, very similar story with price floors. There's one last point I want to make about price floors and price ceilings. Notice that when you stop prices from being the way in which goods are allocated, you prevent price from moving, you get all of these other ways of allocating goods. You get people waiting in line, right? You get do you know someone, right? Do you have a cousin in the gasoline industry who can get you some gas, right? So all these other ways of doing it. The book talks about a bunch more that I'm not going to mention, right? That we get all these what we call non-price allocation mechanisms. And that's interesting to think about for a second, right? Because oftentimes people say things like, well, it's not fair that certain goods are allocated by price and who's willing to pay. So for example, healthcare, people say, well, it shouldn't be a matter of who's willing to pay. People should get healthcare, we should allocate healthcare by other means. Okay, how? How are you going to do this? Right? What exactly are you going to, if it's not price, how are you going to allocate the good? Are you going to give it away randomly, have a lottery and just give it away randomly? Are you going to say first come, first serve, right? Oftentimes we see that with shortages. People are going to get in line, get there first. Are we going to have some kind of rationing system where we say, if your address is an even number, you get the good on a certain day, an odd number on another day? Is that what we want to do? Do we want to have something like Fight Club, where we simply, battle each other for goods and services? That's one way to allocate goods, to figure out who should get them. So we could also talk about need. We could simply say to people, write us an essay about why you need this good and decide from there. Now, one problem there, of course, is how do we adjudicate among different needs? But there's a problem with all of these non-price allocation mechanisms that I want to point out. All of them assume there's just a supply of the good there, and the problem is, how do we divide it up? Whether it's Fight Club, waiting in line, random allocation, right? All of these things just assume there's like a pile of stuff there, and we got to figure out how to get it to people. That's not the economic problem. The economic problem is not just how do we figure out who gets what, but how do we encourage people to continue to produce more and more of the good? Think about all those other non-price allocation mechanisms. Fight Club is the most obvious, right? People start spending money on baseball bats and guns and stuff and fight each other, and we finally figure out, a couple strong people take all the goods, and that's how we determine who gets the goods. Now what, right? Where's the next set of goods going to come from, and who's going to be willing to supply them if they have to spend lots of resources protecting them in Fight Club, right? Same with all the other non-price allocation mechanisms. What's the problem with those is there's no connection between allocating the goods, determining who gets the goods, and incentive to produce. Allocating by line doesn't do it. Allocating by random doesn't do it. Only one way connects up the allocation of resources and the production of resources, and that's doing it by price. If we allocate by price and the price goes up because lots of people want the good, that's a signal that says we need to produce more of it. If the price goes down, we know that people aren't as interested in it. So the ability to watch prices and earn profits by producing goods is crucial to how we decide how those goods both get produced and allocated. Only the price system. Right? Whatever its flaws, it's not perfect. And we think about things like healthcare, right, where it's difficult sometimes. But the great advantage of it is that it encourages suppliers to supply more of the good. No other system does that. And you can see a good example of this. I've been using the sort of price controls during an emergency example. One of the supplemental videos for this chapter is an interview I did on CNN talking about this issue. And I'm not going to spoil it all, but if you go and see that, you'll notice that I talk about two things there. I talk about this question of when we allow prices to move freely, we help ensure that the most valuable uses, people use the good for the most valuable uses possible. But perhaps more important, prices moving freely encourage other people to bring in new supplies and to resolve the shortage that's the problem after the disaster. I'll let you watch that and see for yourself. But as you watch that, think about all the things we've been talking about here in Chapter 5 as we've talked about price ceilings and price floors.